Good evening, everyone. I'm Kim McQuarrie, and I'm the Director of Programming and the Co-Director of the Innovation Labs. And I can see that a few people got the memo that we're having a costume contest after this. So even if you didn't get the memo, join us next door, or grab a cocktail and grab some treats and watch the festivities. So we want to thank you for joining us for this spooky season lecture that's presented by my amazing colleague, Peter Tush, the Senior Curator of Education here at the Dalí. If you're planning to visit the galleries later, you can catch some pop-up tours about Dalí's spooky and spectral interests. And then if you're in a social frame of mind, you can join us next door at 7 for the costume contest. Now, if you enjoy programs like those we're going to have tonight, then please make sure that you're keeping up with all of our events on the webpage. And I just want to give you a little preview. November is going to be pretty busy, very exciting. We're going to have our Coffee with the Curator lecture, first Wednesday of the month, as always. And this time it's going to be my colleague, Di Birmingham, and she's going to be talking about the role of the museum store. A lot of times we pass the museum store and we don't really understand the role that the store has in supporting our mission, especially our educational mission. And then we're going to have the first of 2 lectures on our temporary exhibit that's next door in the RJ that focuses on the poetry of Paul Éluard. And the first lecture is going to be given by Peter, and he's going to give us a little introduction. And then we'll have another one on the 17th by Dr. Alex Lenoble of USF, and he's going to be talking about Éluard and the power of poetry. So be sure to catch both of those. We're going to have some live brunch music on Sunday the 6th with our St. Pete Sax Quartet. That's always a lot of fun. And then our Poetry at the Dalí series will be on November 10th. And then we're going to have special activities all day on Veterans Day. That'll be free admission, obviously, for our military and veterans. And then we'll also have a special lecture by Peter on Dalí and the Faces of War, and an opportunity to create some Dalí-inspired cards to send to military members stationed overseas. And then finally, we'll round out the month of programming with yoga and story time. Now, if you haven't heard, the really exciting thing that's going to happen in November is going to be our Shape of Dreams exhibit is going to be opening. Be sure to catch member preview days if you're a member, and if you're not, become one, on November 21st through the 23rd. And the exhibit's going to open to the public on November 25th. It's going to be absolutely phenomenal. Over 500 years of exploration of the source, nature, and utility of the dream in our lives. So lots of fun stuff. Yeah. Now, tonight, though, instead of dreams, or maybe if we're going to talk about dreams, tonight there'll be nightmares, because we're going to be talking about Dalí's ghosts with Peter, and he's going to focus on the phantoms and the specters. It's my pleasure to introduce him. Now, most of you know that Peter is our Senior Curator of Education, and that he's been here for several decades. Now, what does it mean to be a Senior Curator of Education? Peter is the key interpreter of our permanent collection, that is our Dalí collection, and he's also the key interpreter of our special exhibits, such as the Canosa that we just had, and the Shape of Dreams that'll be opening at the end of this month. In that capacity, he trains our docents who give all of the wonderful tours that we enjoy in the permanent collection and the special exhibits. He scripts the audio guides that you might listen to as you're trolling the galleries. And he directs our school programming. So he's impacting the lives of children and teaching them the value of art and art appreciation via Dalí. And he works with the curatorial team to develop special exhibits. Now, of course, over the years, he's been a fixture of all of our programming, including talks and special presentations on a wide range of subjects, everything from Van Gogh's influence on musical artists, to women in Surrealism, to Dalí's interest in bread. Now tonight, I mean, you'd be surprised, bread's a lot sexier than you think. But tonight he's going to be presenting a really fun talk on Dalí's ghosts, where he will explore the spectral domain of Dalí's art. So please join me in welcoming Peter.
Thank you, Kim, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming out tonight for what I think is one of the more fun talks that we get to enjoy. And I've done this, I think, 3 times now, so it has become sort of a fixture around the holidays, it seems. And speaking of fixtures and holidays, I also do a radio show on WMNF, and I just wanted to say, because it is Halloween, I just did a show this Sunday night on Prelude to Halloween. So if you're looking for something to enjoy while getting ready over the weekend for the holidays, you can just click on our on link with WMNF on Sunday nights, and they keep the show live for a week, so you can listen to it through this Sunday night. So that said, we are here to talk about spectral things. This is Dalí's Ghost is the name of the talk, focusing on phantoms and specters in the 1930s. And there's a couple things that I'm going to try to hopefully accomplish through this talk. First, establish Dalí as having an interest in the macabre. The second is talking about some of the Surrealist and also the Spanish concepts of ghosts that may have influenced his concepts. Going to explore this primary period of time. It's about 1933 to 36, right in the middle of his deepest involvement in Surrealism. Going to look at this particular term that he has, this idea that ghostly terminology separating phantoms from specters, and he has some very distinct ideas about what separates the two. And then we're going to talk about the fact that there is a character Dalí introduces in the mid-30s that is an actual true ghost for him, which is his cousin. And finally, we're going to wrap it up with just why does this period end? What happens next? What goes away? So let's get right down to it. The first question is, what is a ghost? What is our concept of it? And here's 2 very simple explanations from the dictionary. One is an apparition of a dead person, which is believed to appear and become manifest in living, typically as a nebulous image. It's also a disembodied soul, especially the soul of a dead person, believed to be an inhabitant of the unseen world or appear to be living in bodily likeness. And both of those are very relevant to what we'll be seeing this evening. And I think the very first place to start is just, how long ago or what were the roots and the seeds of origin for Dalí's interest in the macabre? And one of the key images, I think, to establish this is right in our own collection, this gouache we have called the Sardana of the Witches. It was a project that Dalí was hired to do. He was paid some money to do this cover in relation to a poem that was written. But it definitely shows a great enthusiasm and connection with this idea of witches dancing the sardanas in Dalí's catechese, with the church in the background and the bay in the foreground, that they are very much indelibly a part of the community with the folklore and the representation of witches. And then we move a little bit further along, and we start to see by 1926, when Dalí is a student, he starts painting some very horrifying images. We start seeing cadavers. We start seeing body parts. Here we have one called Honey is Sweeter Than Blood, where we actually have a female representing Venus who's been decapitated, and arms and legs are taken off, and there's a pool of blood in front of her. We also have a face over on the far right-hand side, which is a face of Dalí's friend Lorca, which has now become a head floating in the background. And we have a rotting donkey in the foreground filled with flies. So this idea about using these kind of images that are both repellent and shocking and grotesque as a way to create a sort of notoriety starts to happen by 1926. By the time Dalí writes his autobiography, there's just page after page after page of marginalia, of details and drawings that Dalí did, and some of them truly have this sort of ghastly, macabre sort of quality to them. So in the upper left, we have a sort of skeletal angel that seems to be floating across the bay. Below that is a hedgehog that's filled with maggots that's being devoured. In the upper right-hand side, we have deformed skulls that seem to be sliced down into the ground. And then there is Dalí and his wife Gala on the very bottom right as the Angelus couple truly spectral as they rot away together. So kind of a horrifying self-portrait. And it's interesting. So George Orwell had a description of Dalí's book. He says, dead faces, skulls, corpses of animals occur frequently throughout the pictures. It is the old-fashioned, over-ornate, Edwardian style of drawing to which Dalí tends to revert when he's not being a surrealist. And actually, I think that's a pretty accurate description. These are very Edwardian in terms of the macabre that Dalí has inherited his enthusiasm for. We also have, around this period of time, Dalí starts painting very unusual specters. So here we have something called the spectral cow, where we have both a curious animal that seems to be a part of the Walking Dead, and then we also have this curious bird-like creature that also seems to appear both dead and alive at the same time. And one of the things that Dalí was captivated by that he shares in his Secret Life is the story that when he was a student at this time at the Residencia in Madrid, his close friend Federico Garcia Lorca would on occasion create this ritual that all of the students would participate in. It's described here. It says, sometimes Lorca would arrange his own funeral and death. He would call to the group of friends and say, hey, everyone, this is how I'll look when I die. And he would throw himself upon the bed, feigning rigor mortis, and direct his companions to a reenactment of his funeral. They would actually carry his body through the dorm and eventually take it to his place where he would be resurrected. This had a very powerful effect on Dalí, and it is this sort of very unusual way of thinking about how we deal with the dead and how we process our friends, thinking about them in the future. There's also, of course, jumping way forward to 1963, Dalí painting the specter of his brother, his dead brother who we never met, but who died 9 months and 11 days before he was born, shared his first name, Salvador, and he was constantly compared with him. So this is a little bit outside of the field of what we're talking about, but certainly this fits into this idea about the ghosts in Dalí's world. So I just did a really quick rundown of titles and how many times there is a kind of ghostly title in one of his works. And there are actually 32 paintings from this period of time, from about 1932 to 1939, where the word ghost, specter, phantom, shade, necrophiliac, apparition, or death appear. So this is definitely not a passing fancy. This is something that Dalí definitely commits to. And now we just shift over to two sources of inspiration. Where are some of these influences coming from that Dalí embraces? And I think the first is pretty straightforward and easy, and that's the fact that both Bosch, Hieronymus Bosch, and Francisco Goya, two artists that had a deep influence on Dalí, have some pretty amazing visions of hell and demons and ghosts. And we start with Hieronymus Bosch, and this is a painting Dalí became very familiar with. It was in the Prado in Madrid when Dalí was going to school there. It's the Garden of Earthly Delights. And some of the details, I think, show you how imaginative Bosch was in understanding the evils and the torments that await us for our bad behavior. And here we have certainly some very incredible creatures and horrible things being done to unfortunate individuals, being carried away and sliced and eaten. This is a favorite. This one's a favorite. You know, so unfortunate gentleman. But it's just such an imaginative way to approach something so ghastly. And I've got to really emphasize this kind of imagination, I think, is what Dalí really thrives on with his artwork. When we shift from Bosch to Goya, who also occupied several rooms at the Prado, we have some really powerful pieces like The Witch's Sabbath. And this is partially painted by Goya in thinking about the fact that he was living during the period of the Enlightenment, but the people were truly connected with folkloric fears and terror. And this really brings that forward. It's like, even though we're in the Enlightenment and the period of science and understanding, the world really is run by this horrifying fear of witches and the Sabbath and how they can control our lives. And there's a couple drawings by Goya that are just really wonderful. This one in particular, a nun frightened by a ghost playing a guitar. And it feels very Asian. There's something about this that feels very much like an Asian piece, but it's fascinating. So we have a nun who seemingly is connected with her understanding of the beyond, and yet this idea that a ghost can terrify her is a really powerful kind of image, how evil and the dead is something you're not protected by even within the church. And then we have this one that's really fun called Here Comes the Boogeyman from the Capriccios. And if you can see the piece, it's a little bit hard to see. It's an amazing etching, but the idea seems to be that the idea of the boogeyman is kept definitely alive by people in their own families in order to keep their children under control. You know, rather than trying to say there is no boogeyman, the world is fine, you've got to be responsible for yourself, they use it as an opportunity to scare the bejeebies out of the kids and keep them in line. And then the final one that I think is really fascinating is this one. It's called The Fear of Folly. And what we have is a group of French soldiers who are terrified by the presence of the specter. And the specter is probably a number of soldiers from the other side, Spanish soldiers who have dressed up to terrorize them. They are the representatives of the Enlightenment, and they are terrified by the most base of all fear, which is the fear of the unknown, the fear of the boogeyman. And they too behave just the way the children did in the other piece. So the idea is that fear is constantly all around us. Our fear and horror of specters and ghosts is something that we live with every day, no matter how enlightened we may feel. So these are things Dalí would have certainly been able to have seen at the Prado. And then we move into the second area, which is spiritualism. You know, one of the great pastimes and enthusiasms that people had at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, was spiritualism in photography. And so I just chose a couple examples. I do not know how much Dalí was aware of all this, but this was certainly part and parcel of culture in the late 19th and early 20th century. But we have, these wonderful composite images, these photo montages that were created to, once again, really reinforce this idea of both maybe ghosts are real, we should certainly fear them, the world is much darker than we think. I'm sure some of them were simply moralistic statements, but people really wanted to believe, in the same way they wanted to believe in fairies and little people, and those types of photos that also were happening at the same time. But these are powerful images. They're very haunting. Here's one by Frederick Hudson of Lady Elena and her spirit, the spirit of her daughter visiting her. And these photos were to suggest that perhaps the camera has caught something our naked eye is incapable of catching. There's this really fun one. This is from a particular book called The Hours with the Ghosts, or 19th Century Witchcraft, Illustrated Investigations into the Phenomena of Spiritualism and Theosophy. And so this is an 1891 photo, but here, of course, a gentleman is trying to defend himself from the evils represented by a spectral apparition. So the argument is that Dalí was certainly aware of these types of photos. We just don't know which ones he would have seen when he was young. And then we move into the last of these areas of influence, and that's the influence of Surrealism itself and their sense of specters and ghosts. And we begin with the fact that André Breton, it's interesting, he is the leader of Surrealism. He's the one who establishes what's accepted and what's not. He says that, he basically felt that spiritualism was bogus. He rejected it outright. And yet it's curious because they employed a lot of the same techniques that the spiritualists did in order to reach the unconscious. So they would use hypnosis and dream dictation as methods to try to access the unconscious that Freud talks about. But these are definitely spiritualist concepts and techniques. They were just trying to use them not to reach the dead, but to reach our inner self. And then we move to one of their influences, Giorgio de Chirico. And here we have this fascination with automatons, animated machines, things that should be like barbershop dummies that actually have taken on a life of their own. And it's uncanny, it's creepy, and it definitely creates that kind of ghostly sense of specters and phantoms. Move forward a little bit, and we have Max Ernst, one of Dalí's colleagues in Surrealism, who creates one of the most ghastly images from the Surrealists. This is The Beautiful Season from 1925, and it had a big influence on paintings that Dalí did in 1928 and 29. So it's almost like he's reimagined this creature that's dead and living simultaneously, where it's been turned inside out. Another piece that I'm sure was fascinating to Dalí, that he must have been excited by, is the idea of Albert Giacometti's haunted house, the palace at 4 a.m. And if you look at this, you can see it's like an open tableau of things that are happening inside this house. And it would certainly fit well in any haunted house movie that you've seen currently. You know, there's some sort of backbone spine that seems to be animated, dangling inside of a cage. There's some sort of spectral, kind of almost like a dinosaur bird, pterodactyl up in the upper left, upper right. There's some ghost-like female figure who is of the manner born. And then something very peculiar that's happening here with what seems to be like a highlight tool. And then finally, we come to the wrapped shrouded figures. So here we have a shrouded form from Man Ray. This is the Enigma of Isidore Ducasse, or L'Autrement. And we don't know what it is, but we assume it's a sewing machine because it has that shape. It also suggests bondage, but definitely has a kind of shrouded form that's very ghostly. And then we go from Man Ray to René Magritte, and we have the curious and somewhat terrifying image of the lovers. And it's worth noting that his mother did die from drowning herself, and when she was found, her night shift had wrapped around her head, which seems to inform this particular image. And then last but not least, an image that Dalí encountered when he was in Paris for the second time, when he was about to be invited to join the Surrealists. He went to Magritte's studio and he saw this painting. And I would argue this had a lot of effect on Dalí's mid-1930s paintings. This is called The Invention of Life. We have a couple, but one of them seems to be a ghost, so non-living. Which brings us to sheets and shades. And this is where we start to see how these types of images start to show up in Dalí's world. So a good example is À bord de la mer, or By the Sea, from our collection. A very tiny painting, but there is a ghost haunting this painting. There is some spectral apparition, maybe a standing stone, but completely white like a sheet that seems to be moving through the space and casting this long, terrifying shadow in the middle of an empty beach. And then we connect it with our piece that's often connected with it, Shades of Night Descending. And we have this incredible beach expanse at twilight. And you can see the little pebble in the very center there has taken on a very, phallic type of shadow that is much darker than anything around it. But off to the side seems to be one of the reasons for its excitement, which is this shrouded thing. And at first it looks like a person because obviously the head looks like the person we saw in the Magritte painting. But then you start to look into the sheet itself down below, and there's a femur poking out towards the bottom. And there's also a shoe, a high-heeled shoe, and a large goblet, almost like a milk glass, like a chalice, underneath the shape of the sheet that's wet and showing through. So a very, very strange concept of what a ghost might be, but this is the shade of the night that's descending. There's a couple other images similar. This is the ambivalent image of 1932, where we have a spectral figure that seems a little more like a mummy, perhaps, than a ghost, but the shadow being cast gives you the sense of a tombstone of some sort, with a female high-heeled shoe on the top of it, just for effect. And then we have this really lovely pairing of very curious pieces. These are small paintings. One is called Dreams on the Beach, and the other one's just called Painting. But in both of them, you can see that there's sort of this collection of objects, including a rod, some hanging fabric, a few odds and ends, and yet the sheet is sort of like from that Man Ray photograph again. There's something about it that it seems to be enveloping something, hiding something, and almost taking on a life of its own. So there's something about these that are doubly haunting because they seem so innocuous, and yet there's something sinister that's being suggested about them. Which moves us into one of Dalí's early obsessions, and that's a particular painting by Arnold Boekling called The Isle of the Dead. This is the painting, The Isle of the Dead. It's one of, I believe, 7 versions of this painting. This is also referred to as Tomb Island, and this was done in 1880. And this is a painting that even influenced and created, there was a movie called The Isle of the Dead with Boris Karloff, where he goes as a soldier to a particular island, and this scene is relatively recreated. But you can see some of the great symbols of death. We have all the cypress trees on the island, which is the symbol of death. You have the shrouded figure in white, who seems to be the one either passing or being taken there. And then you have this very curious island that truly seems to be tombs, so that this would be the isle beyond our realm. Would have been lovely to get this for our show on Dreams. This seems very, very powerful. Two big heroes, or two big fans of Böcklin, Adolf Hitler and Sigmund Freud. So strange bedfellows, but both of them were absolutely fascinated by Böcklin's work and obsessed by it. Dalí writes about this. He says, "For the rest of the afternoon, I intended to write a section of a very long study of Böcklin, a study which has preoccupied me for some time now, which will constitute one chapter of a huge work that I named for the time being Surrealist Painters Through the Ages." So for Dalí, Böcklin was one of the most important artists that prefigured Surrealism. And so he wanted to write a very long study, which never came to pass, unfortunately. And just a couple other images of Böcklin to give you the full effect. This one is the Berlin version from a few years later, 1883. You can see the shrouded figure, the detail of Charon, the ferryman of Hades. And then we come to Dalí's variations. And this is what's really interesting, is this becomes this prelude to specters and phantoms, because Dalí starts creating some paintings about Böcklin. Some of them are very innocuous. This is a really unusually, not bland, but certainly no specters that you immediately see. There's some strange things going on with this teacup over here on the left-hand side, but it's called The Real Painting of the Isle of the Dead by Böcklin at the Hour of the Angelus. So this one's 1932. And then we move into a really wonderful piece. This is called The West Side of the Isle of the Dead, Reconstituted Compulsive Image after Böcklin. So Dalí's thinking about this island as having a locale and an east and a west and an up and a down. So this is 1934. And when we look very closely at the Isle of the Dead, that ghost has suddenly taken on some very unusual attributes and characteristics. It's become incredibly jagged and angular. It no longer seems to be quite that shrouded figure that we saw in the boat, but now it's become very animated and sharp. Looks like you could get cut on this particular beast. And then there's this one, which is the central courtyard from the Isle of the Dead, the reconstructed obsession after Böcklin. And here, when we get the detail, it's basically a rib cage with a few bony shards coming off of it. So the shroud seems to have disappeared completely, and now we're left with the corpse of the Isle of the Dead. Which brings us to this idea of shrouded versus non-shrouded. Dalí is a shrouded ghost. So again, coming back to this piece by René Magritte, Dalí hired Man Ray in 1933 to do a couple photographs for him for an article he was writing. And we can look at this and see the ghost-like apparition that Magritte has painted. And then we look at these two photos of Dalí. And this is Dalí seeming to me, especially on the right-hand side, very much replicating that image that he saw in the Magritte painting. But of course, with the addition of a very curious object balancing on his head. What these objects represent, how they relate to bread, all those kinds of things, that's a different talk. That's for other times. But this is part of an article called The New Colors of Spectral Sex Appeal. So this is the sex appeal, the kind of appropriate clothing for being sexy when you're dead. You know, I think that might be the best way to think of it. Or the best kind of, the best fashion for necrophiliacs might be the other way to say it. And here's the article. So Dalí has this very elaborate article that appears in a Minotaur, one of the magazines Surrealism worked with, and this is 1934. And this brings us to this conversation of phantoms versus specters, because that's what this article really focuses on. You expect to find out what are the fashion highlights, you know, is it high-heeled red shoes, is it very tight-fitting clothing? But it turns into something far different than that, and it's really Dalí trying to argue the different qualities between these two types of ghosts. So phantoms versus specters. And this is, in a nutshell, the difference visually. The one on the left-hand side is a phantom, bulbous, kind of big, sort of round, rotund, a little bit formless. And the one on the right is the specter, which is very bony and slick and sharp and razor-edged and fast. And I would argue that these two types are also modeled on Dalí's ongoing hero, Pablo Picasso. And what I mean by that is the one on the left-hand side is very much like the Phantom of Dalí. This is a mother and child, very rotund, very beautiful, very fleshy. And then we have the seated bather on the right-hand side from Picasso's Surrealist period, where she's very much like an insect. She's sharp, she's angular, she's threatening. She seems very much like she could consume us. And so it's that idea of the threat of cannibalism. And you can also see her mandibles, her mouth, has this ability to chop. So I think this is part of what's informing Dalí's choice here. So we're going to look very quickly at the language Dalí uses. He says that phantoms are something apparently seen, heard, or sensed, but they have no physical reality. A ghost or an apparition, something elusive or delusive. So specters are ghostly apparitions in contrast to that. And then he goes further and he says that phantoms have contours that accentuate volume. So think back to the image we saw a moment ago, something kind of bulbous, a woman seen from behind, and they're associated with plaster or cotton. So maybe that's where the sex appeal of clothing comes in. A specter, in contrast, is rays that shred contours. So silk or asbestos is the contrast. And we go a little bit further with this. Phantoms are about height, whereas specters are about speed. Phantoms are immobile. They're planted wherever they are, where specters seem to be instantaneous. They're everywhere. Phantoms are enveloped insinuation, where specters are blazing manifestations. I'm not sure if that's helping in the slightest, but it's very entertaining to read it. And it goes a little further. So phantoms are vertical, whereas specters are diagonal. Elevators versus staircase banisters, curves versus ridges. Phantoms are receivers of light. Specters are projectors of light. And returning back to our original couple, perhaps some of those words might start to take hold. So phantoms are somewhat bulbous, they're big, they seem to bring light to them, they don't have really any substance, whereas a specter is sharp, it's slick, it's horizontal, or it's diagonal, it can cut, it is something that manifests light itself, it's about speed. That kind of slickness of the skull, which has been polished clean, is the contrast to the much more voluminous, kind of indefinable nursemaid that we have on the left-hand side. And then there's a painting that conveniently for us brings together these two things. It's called The Spectre and the Phantom from 1934. We have that same woman at the very bottom, Dalí's nanny, and then we have this voluminous cloud with a rainbow coming out of it, and we do have a large cypress tree over here in the bottom left. And Dalí says that the opposition between the volume of the nursemaid and the ephemeral virtuality of the rainbow echoes the opposition between the phantom-like cloud and the spectral cypress. So what he's saying here is that the phantom, this bulbous kind of woman who's very grounded and seemingly, billowy, is very much like the cloud. It has no substance, but it seems to all be volume reflecting light. Whereas the rainbow and the cypress tree off to the side are much more like that skull. They're slick, they're harsh, they are manifested quickly, they are about speed. And so I don't know if that starts to help, but you'll see very quickly, there's a lot more specters in Dalí's work than there are phantoms. So some of the phantoms that he uses, for example, here we have, again, his nursemaid. A phantom is a substantial figure wrapped in a sheet, a shoe on the head, the nursemaid in question on the beach, sitting in the water, a boiled potato, Messinier's Napoleon at the head of the cavalcade, the Mona Lisa, La Gioconda. Those are phantoms. Know the difference, right? Dalí goes, there's a very good Dalí scholar, and she says that phantoms are obese bodies whose volume allows for the realization of the irrational. The prototype is the Hitlerian wet nurse, which we see here, seated on the beach, immobile, immense, very tender back, rounded and nourishing. So that's what a phantom is. And here we have a couple more examples of these. Here we have the kind of shroud that's also sheet and somewhat bulbous. Here we have one, the young girl with a skull, and the skull is now the phantom, which she seems to be sort of playing like an accordion. And then we come to specters. And again, specters are more like insects. So Dalí's example of a spectral representation, a very large anamorphic skull, blindingly white, mad, sodomizing with its clear jaw a ruined grand piano. All of this taking place in the bright spring sun behind an old tarred black boat abandoned on the deserted and ill-equipped beach on which hop along some sparrows. So he likes to think about this in a very almost decorative way. So the sparrows are definitely part of the presentation. And then again, that scholar, Astrid Rufus, says specters are visceral, they're aerodynamic, and they're cannibal figures with soft parts that mark their violent eroticism. The prime example is this particular painting called The Spectre of Sex Appeal. It's bony, disjointed, without clothes. It's bowed, it's a fossil, and it's partially limp. So it's a very curious thing, but you can definitely see the difference between a figure like this and hopefully Dalí's nursemaid in the way that she's presented. So then what we start to see now is a whole population for about 3 years of specters and phantoms, and mostly they're specters. So here's one called the Javanese Mannequin, was one of the favorites of our collector, Reynolds Morse, from 1934. Definitely a specter. It's got a bit of a rib cage that's made out of a ship hull. We've got bony body parts that are held up by crutches. There's parts of the flesh that have eroded and been eaten away. And there's a few of those little sparrows that Dalí liked that he mentioned a moment ago, right at the foot. They seem to be eating at the foot. Here's the Night of Death. And this Night of Death is an iridescent specter accompanied by a rainbow, another spectral image. Dalí gives us the very unhelpful distinction of knowing a couple historical phantoms versus a couple historical specters. He said, Freud is more like a phantom where Picasso's like a specter. De Chirico is more of a phantom where Gala, his wife, is a specter. Greta Garbo is a phantom. Harpa Marx is a specter. And Mona Lisa, La Gioconda, is a phantom, whereas Marcel Duchamp, specter. Don't know if that's going to help, but just, let that run through your mind a little bit and think about it. And then we come to the next level, which is the ghosts of Malay, which I would argue are almost always specters. So when we come to Malay, we know that the Angelus couple that Dalí's fascinated by has a lot to do with cannibalism. And we go back to the original one. Dalí says that Jean-François Millet is the inadvertent painter of the most important phantoms. So he says they're phantoms. And indeed, he shows us a few phantoms. So here we have from one of the illustrations for La Chance de Maldoror, here we have the Angelus skulls as phantoms. They're kind of beefy. They seem to be like shrouds. They're ghostly, like the Magritte painting was. They're very much like typical ghosts that are also skulls. But they have volume and at the same time probably no substance. But then we move a little further, and in Atavism of Twilight, the gentleman seems to be taking on more of a spectral appearance since he's been cannibalized at this point. And he's also become limp and fossilized and all those good things that happen. And then we move into the Spectre of the Angelus from 1934, where definitely the Angelus has moved away from those phantomish ghosts to becoming much more insect-like, much more of a creature that seems like alien, maybe. Might be a good comparison. And then we moved from this one particular painting to an artist. One of Dalí's greatest heroes is Jan Vermeer. And Jan Vermeer, one of the great painters of the Baroque period. Here's his painting, The Allegory of Painting, which is just a fabulous work. Dalí was obsessed by him, and then mid-1930s, he starts to see Vermeer becoming a specter. And so we have, of course, our Ghost of Vermeer of Delft. So this is a ghost, but it can be used as a table. And I would argue that the way this Vermeer is presented, he is a specter for sure. He's like the specter of sex appeal we saw a few minutes ago. So it's also the phenomenological theory of furniture nutrition is a subtitle for this. And then we move a little further to a work that's in a private collection. This is The Ghost of the Vermeer of Delft. Again, a specter under a moon. There is a phantom appearing to it, but definitely the specter is Vermeer himself. And then we have this piece, which is at the Teatro Museo Dalí in Figueres. This is the enigmatic elements of a landscape. And this goes back to the pieces we saw about Boclin's Isle of the Dead, but you can see there's that same apparition there, which I would argue is a specter. What would be the right word for this? A specter mimicking a phantom, because it's got the shroud around it, but the hard edges are starting to transform and break out. And then a few more just to share and wrap it up, because these are just images you never see anywhere else. But this is Spectres from 1934, a very curious one. It's almost like a woman and her attendant, where there seems to be sort of at the toilette or something, where there seems to be a mirror that's being used and a lot of shiny surfaces and even flowers. So that's a flower pot on the head of the specter. And then we've got this one, which is much different. This is the cannibalism of the praying mantis of L'Autremont from 1934. And here, definitely the insect aspect of it's really pronounced. It's a leg that's also part of a piece of beef, but it also has the appearance of the back abdomen of an insect. And then you have the two of them doing battle with one another. So great fun. And then we have, of course, the specter of Vermeer's chair, which something absolutely phenomenal is happening here with the poor Vermeer, where the cypress tree has now emerged out of him, again, almost like an alien. I think might be a good comparison once again. The chair in question is actually this chair that's right here in the foreground that's just very lovely and innocuous. And then we have Dalí's wife, Gala, sort of oblivious to what's happening behind her. She seems very comfortable just staring out into the landscape with all these fantastic things happening behind her. So this kind of brings to a certain point a closure with these 1933 to 35 paintings dealing with specters. And now we're going to start moving towards apparitions and then Dalí's cousin, which I think are all related. I think they're all part of the same fabric, but they're a slightly different thing. So we were looking at phantoms versus specters. Now we move into phantoms, or not phantoms, but apparitions. And this is a double image that's one of the great classics of Dalí's, core surrealist period. It's called the Phantom Cart. And what we see here is a cart that's moving into the background, into that village. But when you look at it very closely, what you notice is that actually we're looking through some sort of opening here, and there's a road. And on the left-hand side, the figure that seems to be seated is actually a road going into the background. The other seated figure actually turns out to be one of these monuments, like the buildings on the right. And the two wheels seem to be just two guideposts along the road going into the background. So it's both a cart and yet it isn't a cart. He's taken it away from us, so it becomes a phantom cart. And that brings us to the amphora. There's a great photograph here. This is Dalí's wife with these two sons of Lydia, the mad woman of Port Legat. Lydia was one of Dalí's greatest inspirations. Her two sons suffered different types of madness. And they're here in a photograph with Gala holding this amphora, this kind of classical Greek or Roman vessel that's been broken. And the reason it's important is because Dalí starts to use it as a device in his paintings of apparitions. And so that brings us to this particular painting, The Fine and Average Invisible Harp. And we see this very curious return to that same photograph we saw a moment ago. Here we have the two brothers. The one who suffers from hydrocephalus now has this incredibly bulbous, prolonged phallic type of brain that's being held up by a crutch off to the side. But he's holding that amphora, and it's the same amphora that we saw in this original photograph. That amphora, Dalí starts to use it in some very, very innocuous paintings to give us the clue or the wink of the eye that what you're looking at is an apparition. And the first of these is the mediumistic paranoid image. And we look at this, it seems innocuous. It doesn't quite seem like a Dalí painting in that there's nothing immediately, like there's no burning giraffes, there's no melting watches, there's no weird phallic shapes coming off people, but you start to look at it and there's something a little unsettling. It's like how are these different groups of people related and what are they doing at the same time on this beach? And it feels like you start to realize these two figures in the bottom right-hand side don't make sense with what they're doing in this particular landscape. And then you start thinking about the gentleman riding the bike, and it's like, that would be very hard to do if it was kind of marshy and kind of muddy, probably not where you'd be riding your bike. And this woman seems to be somewhat finely dressed to be laying in the mud along the beach. And then we notice the amphora down here at the bottom. And the amphora is almost like the trick to show us in our dreams that we're dreaming. You know, you see the amphora and it's like, oh yeah, it's a dream. It's something I don't have to worry about. And it starts appearing elsewhere. So we come to the sun table, a little more of a Dalí-esque kind of image, but still we have a camel, we have a table in the middle of nowhere, we have a boy who we start realizing is painted so black he's actually a negative image of a boy. There's no person there, that's the shadow. There's two boats, and then there's that broken amphora again. And the amphora is there to remind us that this is an apparition. We have two more of these. This one's called White Calm. Everything seems fine initially, and then you're like, well, what's the scarecrow-like figure doing over here on the left? That doesn't quite make sense. Then you realize the distance between the woman in the foreground and the man in the background seems wrong. The perspective doesn't work right in the slightest. And then you notice the amphora in the bottom left. And the last example of this is this one here. This is called the paranoid astral image. There's a boat that's moored, and yet two people are sitting in it, including Dalí as a child. There's a woman drifting along in the background, seemingly disconnected from them. And there's a gentleman over here, and you probably can't see it, but there's sort of like a scarf that's on top of his head that seems suddenly to be billowing up like there's a great gust of wind that seems absent everywhere else. And then you notice the amphora. And again, it's like this is this collage that doesn't seem in any way Dalí-esque until you start to notice what's not working about it. And that brings us to this next detail, which is that the woman in the background is somebody we start to see haunting Dalí's canvases. And that's because this is Dalí's cousin, Carolineta. So Carolineta was Dalí's cousin. She was actually his aunt. She was his grandmother's sister's daughter. Her name was Carolineta. She was 34 years old and a spinster. And when Dalí was 10 years old, she passed away. She died of meningitis. She was someone he was very fond of as a child. Losing her, I think, was a very profound loss. But by the mid-1930s, she starts to become an apparition haunting these landscapes. And so here we have one called The Apparition of My Cousin Carolineta at the Beach of Roses. You can see her on the bottom right. We also have The Apparition of My Cousin Carolineta at the Beach of Roses in a Fluid Premonition. And she's always seemingly associated with the cypress tree and also the billowous cloud. So the phantom and the specter presence. Here she is in the moment of transition where she starts to haunt the phantom cart. So the phantom cart on the right, she's on the left. She's also in our morphological echo upstairs, which is a painting that shows us how to create hallucinations. She's the one on the mid left-hand side. You can see her there above the spoon. And then she also haunts the background of Forgotten Horizon in 1936. So this is the detail that we saw a little while ago. And I would argue that what happens to her is she suddenly becomes subsumed in a much more familiar image from Dalí, which is the girl skipping rope. Around this particular period of time, around 1935 to 36, she disappears, and suddenly the girl skipping rope as an apparition of childhood starts haunting Dalí's paintings. So it's a curious kind of transition. The apparition of the girl skipping rope was inspired by the bell tower at his sister's school. Dalí kept thinking the bell tower looks like a girl skipping rope, and suddenly she becomes a real character in his work. And this brings us to more or less the conclusion, which got a couple slides to kind of get us through, but why do these ghosts sort of disappear at the end of the 1930s? And what's happening in Dalí's work to make them a thing of the past? And the main argument, which is a really simple one, is simply that the war comes, the Spanish Civil War, and then of course World War II, and the idea of ghosts becomes much more real, much more present, and it needs a different response. And that response is monsters. And I would argue that monsters start to populate Dalí's work at the end of the 30s, and the ghosts really disappear. So this creature that's tearing itself apart, Dalí says, according to Nostradamus, the apparition of monsters presages the outbreak of war. The canvas has a prophetic character, and he's talking about this particular canvas painted just before the Spanish Civil War broke out. And definitely it goes right back to the same sources. This is Goya's Saturn devouring his son, definitely the inspiration for Dalí's work. And then we have this piece from the Art Institute of Chicago called The Invention of Monsters, which is inspired by Leonardo da Vinci. But you can see these double-faced figures, including this one of Dalí and Gala together. And there are creatures, including, of course, a burning giraffe, that start to move us in a much more horrific kind of landscape. You can make the same argument for the metamorphosis of Narcissus, where the second hand over here on the right is bone. It's been stripped away. It's a little bit like a specter that we saw before. And there's a dog eating some sort of flesh on the bottom right, which seems to have also become ghostly. We have the endless enigma, which contains in it the one-eyed monster, the Cyclops that he refers to it. We have a reference to Picasso's monsters. This is the debris of an automobile giving birth to a horse biting a telephone. Amazing title. And I think you could also argue that this idea of monsters and death and necrophilia informs the Rainy Taxi, which was such a hit during the International Surrealist exhibition in Paris, where we have these corpses that are caught inside of this, and the driver seems to be much more of a monster with this kind of shark jaw around his head. And then the last thing just to say about this is the monsters go away after the war, or maybe even during the war. Things start to change pretty radically. And by 1945 to 1950, Dalí pivots his career radically away from all of these kind of ghastly, shocking, horrifying, grotesque images. And what we suddenly arrive at are the Raphaelesque images, the images of pure beauty, the images of science, the images of Catholicism for a modern age. It's like Dalí deliberately puts the monsters out of his world and puts the apparitions and the specters out of his world to start thinking about this kind of idea of Renaissance beauty. And that really is sort of the end of the ghosts. So the ghosts really populate the mid-1930s, and then they disappear after the war. And so with that, just a couple quick things. We started with talking about Dalí's interest in the macabre and some of the sources of that, both Spanish and Surrealist. The period of time of ghosts in Dalí's work seems to be 33 to 36. He has this obsession with trying to separate phantoms and specters. He has this prediction that specters will overtake the phantoms as the type of modern ghost that is out there. Personal ghosts, we know cousin Carolineta was somebody who suddenly starts to haunt his work and then gets replaced by the girl skipping rope. And last but not least, it seems that the war leads to the conclusion of these horrific images. And you can think of something like Daddy Longlegs of the Evening Hope, where there's something different haunting that image. And even though there are war images in the 1940s, they're no longer about these ghosts, they're no longer about specters or phantoms. Dalí moves on into something very different altogether. With that, I hope this was interesting. Hope it gets you in the mood for the holidays. Thank you all very much for coming out. And it's just about 7 o'clock, so I invite you all to go and join us next door for the costume contest. So thank you.